Okay, in this video, I'm going to talk to you about how you can obtain both total and specific indirect effects when running a path analysis through the AMOS program. So what I have right here is just a basic model that I've drawn out. I have two exogenous variables, mastery goals and performance goals, and I've got three endogenous variables in the model. So when you're looking at the various effects, first of all, keep in mind that the single-headed arrows pointing from one variable to another, those individual arrows, all of them would be considered direct effects in the model. And so when you're looking at the regression coefficients table and the output, those are essentially direct effects. Now, we may also be interested not just in the direct effect of one variable on another, but we also may be interested in indirect effects. So I'll just call it IE for indirect effects. And so when we talk about indirect effects, what we're getting at is the concept of mediation. So what we're doing is we're modeling mediating factors between one variable and another. For instance, within this model we have mastery. We have a direct effect being modeled between mastery goals and achievement. But we also have three indirect effects that are being modeled. And so when the indirect effects are essentially calculated by multiplying path coefficients. So for instance, let's call this path path A and this path path B. So there is an indirect effect of mastery on achievement being modeled when we take path A and multiply it by path B. We also have another way in which mastery is being modeled as having an indirect effect on achievement, and that is through its effect through the mediating variable anxiety. So in this case, we might call this path C and call this path D right here. And so then we would have essentially path C being multiplied by path D. Finally, we can have another indirect effect being modeled, and that would be essentially we would be looking at the effect of mastery through two intervening variables, namely interest and anxiety. So we might call this path down here, we might call this path E, in which case we would be the indirect effect would be calculated by taking path A, so this path right here, times path E times the path D that we have right here. So we have three separate kind of specific indirect effects of mastery on achievement. And if we add all of those indirect effects together, then that gives us essentially a total indirect effect. And when you run, when you ask for indirect effects through AMOS, the typical approach, what you're going to end up with is a total indirect effect. And oftentimes what people are interested in is not just the total indirect effect, but the indirect effect of a given causal sequence within the model. So we also have, there is one other indirect effect being modeled here, and that is looking at performance goals to achievement. And I might call this path F, and essentially the indirect effect would be path F times path D would give me the indirect effect of performance goals on achievement. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first run the model as it's laid out right here, and then I'm going to show you how, and that's going to give us the total indirect effect. And then what I'll do is I will demonstrate how you can obtain specific indirect effects. So as you can see, I've drawn the model out, and the data's already set up. I've already imported the data into the program. By the way, the data set that I'm using is a complete data set. If you happen to have an incomplete data set, if you try to generate Bootstrap samples or Bootstrap standard errors and confidence intervals, it's not going to work. You have to have a complete data set to do that. And you can utilize some type of imputation strategy. One quick approach would be to go up here through analyze data imputation, and essentially you can generate a new data set where there's imputation, and then you feed that into the model and run the model off of that new data set. So that's kind of a quick and easy approach to doing this. So at any rate, under analysis properties, I've gone ahead and selected these. Under output, I've selected indirect, direct, and total effects. And by the way, the total effect in the model is going to reflect all of the different ways in which the relationship between one variable and another variable can be reflected. So, like I said, we had 3 indirect effects. We have a direct effect for mastery and achievement. So all these different kinds of effects will sum up into a total effect. So at any rate, kind of going back here, when we look at if we want to generate Bootstrap standard errors and confidence intervals for our indirect effect, we can click on Perform Bootstrap. Here I've set the number of Bootstrap samples to 2,000. We have bias corrected confidence intervals, and I've set this at 95 for a 95% confidence interval. So now when I run the analysis, I get all the standard output. There are my unstandardized estimates, standardized estimates. Under view text right here, we can see the model fit. As you can see, we actually have a pretty good model fit. There's our chi-square goodness of fit test. The CFI is 0.999. TLI is 0.995. When we look at the RMSEA down here, it's 0.02. So we have really a pretty good fitting model right there. So when we look at the individual estimates and for the model, we'll scroll up here and you can see, as I said before, each path represents a direct effect in the model. So we can see that the direct effect of mastery on interest is positive and statistically significant. Mastery on anxiety is negative and statistically significant at the 0.05 level. Interest to anxiety, that coefficient is not statistically significant. Performance goals on anxiety, that's also not significant. Interest to achievement, that was actually statistically significant. And then the remaining 2 significant path coefficients are for performance goals to achievement and mastery to achievement. Both of those are indicating statistical significance. So if I want to look at the indirect effects, I can click on estimates, go to matrices down here, and we can click on indirect effects. So what you see right here are the indirect effects of mastery and performance goals on achievement. So you can see right here the indirect effect. This is unstandardized. The total indirect effect of mastery on achievement is 0.16765. The total indirect effect for performance goals is negative 0.0001. You also notice that there is also one other indirect effect I kind of failed to mention, but that is the indirect effect of interest on achievement, which is negative 0.00049. And that is essentially captured in, we have interest here, anxiety, and achievement. So we have essentially these 2 paths which would be multiplied to capture that indirect effect. So at any rate, in terms of testing our indirect effects, our total indirect effects for statistical significance, you can see that once we've selected matrices and selected a particular effect, which I've selected right here, down here, these estimate options fill in and become darkened. And so now you can see if I click on Bootstrap standard errors, these are the standard errors for each of the total indirect effects. So there's this standard error for the indirect effect of mastery on achievement, performance goals on achievement, and interest on achievement. If I want the 95% confidence intervals, I can click on Bootstrap confidence. And so here you can see we have the lower bound and the upper bound for the 95% confidence interval for the total indirect effect. So the lower bound for the indirect effect for mastery on achievement is 0.0555. So I'll just say 0 or 0.0555. And the upper bound is 0.28972. So I'm just going to say 0.289, and we'll just give it that. Okay, so the null hypothesis is that the indirect effect of your predictor on your outcome variable, that the indirect effect is equal to 0. In this case, the total indirect effect is equal to 0. So if 0 falls outside of this range right here, then we would determine that or infer that the indirect effect in the population is non-zero. So we would say that the indirect effect was statistically significant. And the alternative hypothesis, by the way, is just that the indirect effect is not equal to 0 in the population. So at any rate, so here we can see that when it comes to mastery, the total indirect effect is inferred to be non-zero within the population. So the indirect effect is statistically significant. When we look at performance goals, the confidence interval ranges between negative 0.002 and 0.0004. So what that tells us, using this line of reasoning up here, 0 falls between the lower bound and the upper bound. So we would infer that the population indirect effect is equal to 0. So we would say then that the indirect effect that we've computed is not statistically significant. The same will go for the interest indirect effect on achievement, as 0 falls between negative 0.019 and 0.0131. Another option is you could go down here and just look at these. These are essentially p-values, and so we could say that if we use a conventional 0.05 level, we would say that the indirect effect of mastery on achievement is statistically significant. The indirect effect of performance goals on achievement is not, and the indirect effect of interest on achievement is not statistically significant as well. So we also have an indirect effect that's presented in this table, which is the indirect effect of mastery on anxiety, and you can see that that's not statistically significant. If we use this confidence band right here, ranging between negative 0.144 and 0.165, you can see that that's not significant. So, as you can see, I've kind of been going through this kind of quickly, so I didn't originally did not kind of offer all of these indirect effects, but there is yet another one, which is this one right here. So I kind of missed that early on, but at any rate, so now we've got sort of a layout of the total indirect effect. Now, what if I want to test out specific indirect effects? Well, the way that we can do this is through we have to label the parameters. And then we have to specify user defined estimands. So you'll notice at the bottom of the screen right here, it's very tiny. It says not estimating any user defined estimand. So that's the default right now. And so what we want to do is to do that. But to accomplish this, first of all, we need to label our paths in the model. So to do that, we're going to right click, and under object properties, we'll make sure that you've selected the right object. So I've selected the arrow, and I'm just going to call this PAR1. And then do the same thing over here. I'm going to call this PAR2, and so forth. All right, so to spare you from me going through bit by bit and doing that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to call up what I've already done. So this is it right here. So you can see I've got PAR1, PAR2, PAR3, PAR4, there's 5, there's 6, and 7 and 8. And you really don't need to label the parameters for any that if you choose just to only look at a subset of the indirect effects, you don't really need to label everything, just the parameters that are going to be included in the specific effects that you're looking for. So at this point, what I'm going to do is, once you've done that, now I'm going to go down here, and previously the box actually said you're not estimating user-defined effects. I've already, like I said, I've already set this up, but basically what I'm going to do is I'm just going to show you how to start it, and then I'll and we'll go from there. So I'm just going to say define new estimands. And in this particular case, a box comes up, and now what I do is I'm going to lay out the specific indirect effects that I want to compute. So what I'll do is I'll say, I'm just going to call the first one SIE1 and say equals PAR1 times, or that's an asterisk, for PAR2. All right, so that's the first one. And then I can do the second one. So let's say I'm going to go, the next one is going to involve path 3 and path 4. So I'll just call this SIE2 equals PAR3 times PAR4. All right, so the naming is arbitrary. But what I'm going to do at this point is, just to make my life easier, and if I want to actually save these specifications, I can do that in this file. So what I'm going to do is I'm also going to add a comment. So to add a comment, you just use an apostrophe, and then I'm going to call this first one, I'm going to say mastery to interest to achieve. And you can see it highlights in green. Then I can say apostrophe, and I can say mastery to anxiety to achieve. And there you go. And then I'll say SIE3 equals to PAR1 times, and that one was PAR5 and 4. So PAR5 times PAR4. Okay, and then I can even give that a title. So I'll just, or a comment, I'll just say mastery to interest to anxiety to achieve. Just kind of highlighting that. So there's that specification right there. If I want to look, at performance goals to achieve, I can do that. I can say, I'll just call this perform to anxiety to achieve, and I'll just call this SIE4 equals PAR 8 and 4. So PAR 8 times PAR 4. And there you go. And so I'm not going to specify everything. This is just to give you a general idea of what's going on. So now what I'll do is I'll click on the check syntax box and make sure it comes up, reads syntax is okay. So you'll notice that my syntax looks good. If there was any kind of problem, then it would tell me, and then I would have to fix it. So at this point, what I will do is I'll click on close, and so it says the file has changed. Would you like to save it? And I can say yes. And I can just call this example specific indirect effects. And click on save, so that if I wanted to run this in the future, I could just call it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here and kind of reopen that, and I can go to let's see if I can find it here. I'm just going to click back on this little box, go to select estimands, and in this case I'll go back to kind of what I'd done a little bit earlier, which is this one right here, just to kind of, so now those are all highlighted. If I want to take a look at it, it's already set up. This is what it's going to look like. So this is how I laid out previously. So at any rate, you can save it and then recall it, and that'll save you the hassle of having to type in every time you do this. I'll just click on close, and now I've got all my previous specifications laid out, and now I'll just click on calculate estimates and go to the view text box, and now you can see again we've got our estimates as before. We have all of our model fit information as before, but also under scalars, click on that. You'll see down here it says user defined commands. So I'll click on that, and so these are the indirect effects, the specific indirect effects that I had calculated. So I actually had named them a little differently as I was walking through and typing them in, but basically we have indirect effects 1, 2, 3, and 4 that are laid out. So it might not be a bad idea to looks like the comments aren't really appearing on here, so it might not be a bad idea when you're laying this stuff out to write out, sort of on a sheet of paper what the indirect effect is and what the label of the indirect effect is, so that you know what you're interpreting. So for this first one right here, it's 0.15397. That's the indirect effect of mastery on achievement via interest. So if I want to test this out, and by the way, these are unstandardized. If I want to test this out, you can see there's my Bootstrap standard errors, and then we also have the Bootstrap confidence intervals and so forth. So you can see for that first indirect effect, this is our parameter estimate right here, the lower and the upper bound, and we interpret, we had already set this up as a 95% confidence interval. So if 0, which is the null hypothesis, falls between the lower and the upper bound, we would maintain the null and infer that that specific indirect effect is equal to 0 within the population. If it falls outside, we would infer that the population indirect effect, or that specific indirect effect, is non-zero. And in this case, we would infer that essentially we have statistically significant specific indirect effect of mastery on achievement via the interest variable. We also do have a p-value, so if you don't want to do that, there's always a p-value that is available. For the second indirect effect through anxiety, that's it right there, and you can see that we have it ranging between negative 0.02 to 0.07, and you can see that that's not going to be statistically significant. And then the other ones in the model which were not statistically significant. So at any rate, just kind of calling this back up, there was the first indirect effect, the second one through anxiety to achieve. Then the third one is involving essentially two mediating variables, and then the fourth one is performance goals. So if I kind of go back and look at this, you can see again that's this one right here involves mastery to interest to anxiety to achieve, and then the fourth one is that performance goals. And so when you look at the confidence intervals for those, you see that neither of those are significant. So really the only significant impact of mastery on achievement in terms of the indirect effect is flowing through the interest variable. So we've essentially broken down the total indirect effect into the specific effects that are significant and non-significant. So really what we've demonstrated is when we are looking at our model right here, the effect of mastery is really, the indirect portion is really occurring through this route, and it's not occurring through this route right here, or sort of involving two mediators. So that pretty well concludes this discussion, and I hope you found this useful.